Hi, this is Professor Stugard, and in this video, we're going to talk about how do we choose the right machine learning algorithm or model for our task. So this should be a fun one because we're really only working on one idea. How do we understand what is the best machine learning model to build to complete the project that we have at hand? So, I'm not the first one who's tried to answer this question. Our main machine learning package, the sklearn, has a cheat sheet that they include with their documentation as well. And I do love that the very first question is, do you have more than 50 samples? And if the answer is no, then you just have to go get more data. But after that, I typically go through a slightly different thought process in my head that I'm going to try to explain now. So once I have enough data, my first question is, do I know what my target variable actually is going to be? If I know what the target is, then I know exactly what it is I'm trying to predict. And if I don't know the target, then typically I'm still trying to understand the structure or some of the underlying patterns in my data. This is also when we say that we have unlabeled data because I don't know what that target's going to be. Now, this is also the distinction between supervised, I know what the target is, and unsupervised, I don't know what the target is, types of machine learning. Whenever I train a machine learning model too, it's also important to remember that we're always going to split our data into training data that builds our model and then testing data that evaluates our model at the end. And when we do that, again, the idea is we build our model with the training data, then I plug in the testing model to see is it actually making accurate predictions based on that model that I've used. And that's always an important part, is evaluating how well our model does at the end. But back to the question about which machine learning model or which machine learning algorithm it is that I want to use. Again, my first question is, do I know the target value, the target variable? And if the answer is no, then I know I'm doing a clustering type of problem. And for clustering, our best algorithm is almost always going to be the k-means algorithm. Now, the k-means algorithm means that we're going to separate our data into k different clusters or k different groups. And this means that we do need to determine how many clusters or how many groups we believe our data should actually be in. Now, I can iterate this process for different values of k, and sometimes this gives me great insight into the data. So maybe I want to try 2 clusters, then 3, then 5, then 10, and see, well, how does that actually group my data? This is how we tune our algorithm. So again, how we tune is really how we change some of our hyperparameters inside of our model so that we hopefully get the best results possible. Now remember, the k-means algorithm, we create those k-centroids, which groups all the data closest to that centroid. Once we have that group data, then we move the centroid to the center of those data. Once we have it in the center of our data, we reapply that algorithm and all the ones closest get grouped, and then based on that new grouping, we move our centroid again to the center, and then we repeat that process and we iterate over and over again until there's no more movement between the groups. And that typically gives us pretty well-defined clusters and gives us an idea of how our data actually should be structured. Now, what if I do know my target variable? What if I do know what it is I'm trying to predict, and I'm going to now be doing a supervised type of machine learning algorithm? Well, I need to know what it is I'm trying to predict first. So now I actually need to ask another question. What am I predicting? Am I trying to predict values or am I trying to predict categories? If I'm trying to predict values, then I want to use a regression model. And if I want to predict categories, I need to use a classification model. So let's start with the regression models first. So regression analysis is when I'm going to build a model or typically just an equation that describes the relationship between our features, which would be our explanatory or our independent variables, and then whatever that numerical target is. Again, I'm trying to predict a variable that is numerical when I use regression. So again, that's going to be a numerical target. That's our response or dependent. So how do I go from my features to my numerical target? Well, like I said, this is going to be a regression model. The simplest type of regression model is linear regression. This is simply where we're going to make a line, and this uses the least squares algorithm to find that line of best fit, and that is going to be the line that minimizes the squared distance to each of those data points, so top and bottom. Now, In the case of just one feature and one target, we get that basic slope-intercept form of a line, the y equals mx plus b, although since we can actually do this in multiple dimensions without necessarily having to graph it or see it in our human brains, the computers can do it for us, a lot of times we do start adjusting our notation. We still keep y as our target, but now we use betas to describe our coefficients and x's to describe the different features that we might be using. And regression models are great because it's very, very easy to evaluate them. We simply plug in our features x to see if it matches what our target y should be from our testing data. And again, it makes it very easy to evaluate whether or not our model is going to be accurate or if it's overfitting or underfitting some of our data. Now, linear regression, though, is only going to be appropriate when our data is actually in a linear pattern. Now, we can check for the strength of our linear pattern or our linear relationship with our linear correlation coefficient R. But we can use other non-linear regression models if our data fits other patterns. So there's other regression models like polynomial regression or exponential regression, and then other ones besides that as well. And we typically try to generalize our regression models using, again, y is our target. Then in our coding, we use that tilde instead of like an equal sign. Then we have our f, which describes if it's going to be linear or polynomial or exponential. And then x is our set of features. So again, the set of features would typically be capital X. We use capital X to represent all of our variables we're using to make those predictions, and subset by I. And then b sub I would be our set of coefficients or the variables that we're trying to find here. That is the part of our model that is actually being built. That is what we are determining. And then that will tell us, again, how we make our function that we can then plug in and make predictions with later. Okay, now there are other models that are used to predict values. For example, we use logistic regression to predict probabilities between 0 and 1, but typically that logistic regression question of probability is actually part of the interpretation part of other models. And so again, a lot of times we combine our models together. We have ensembles of different types of algorithms working together to solve our problems. And again, the better we understand each individual part, the better we will be able to hopefully build accurate machine learning models for whatever problem it is that we are facing. But like I said, with the logistic regression, a lot of times we take that probability between 0 and 1 and actually interpret it as, well, what is the probability it's going to fit in certain different categories? And so the logistic regression is typically going to be part of, and not the final step, our classification models. So let's talk about classification now. With our classification models, there's lots of different types of questions, so classification is really broad, because we might want to classify text, or we might want to classify values or images, or really anything we can kind of imagine. And so classification, we need to also determine, well, am I trying to classify something as a binomial, either it belongs or not, true or false, success or failure, yes or no? Or is it more of a multinomial classification system, where I want to sort the data into different groups or classes that are bigger than just the yes or no? You know, for example, like image recognition, is it a cat, a dog, or a bird? Okay, we have multiple categories that I want to try to classify that image as. Now, we also want to keep in mind that sometimes I want to know how those features are being used to classify objects, and that's because there are sometimes with some machine learning algorithms, we're not going to know why the machine is doing what it's doing, and that might be a problem depending upon what our actual task is, or what our goal is going to be at the end if I want to be able to explain why it is we're doing what we're doing. Now, down to the classification. What am I classifying? Well, is it going to be text, images, or is it something else? If it's text, then we typically want to use the naive Bayes algorithm. Now, naive Bayes uses Bayes' theorem to calculate the probability that a text passage belongs to a certain category. So that makes the naive Bayes typically a binomial classification algorithm. Either it belongs or it does not, because it's calculating a probability between 0 and 1. Naive Bayes uses the frequency of the words that it is trained on, but not the order, to make its prediction. And once trained, naive Bayes is incredibly powerful and can be used for our spam filters. We can use it to determine whether or not a passage was written by Shakespeare or anyone else. We can classify really any text that we've trained our model with to hopefully fit into one of those two binomial categories, a yes or a no. What is really nice about naive Bayes is that it is also very, very quick in terms of the training model. Again, we literally just look at the frequency of words, use that to kind of set up our naive Bayes theorem, and our model gets built very quick and very easy. Now, if I am trying to classify images, then typically this is the job of a neural network. Now, neural networks can actually be tasked to solve almost every type of machine learning problem. I can set up a neural network to classify text, but the problem is, well, neural networks are very costly and time-consuming to train, which means they are not always going to be the best choice. And also, with our neural networks, it is very, very difficult to figure out the how or the why a neural network is doing the things that it's doing. This is why neural networks are often called black box models. However the neural network is making its choices is kind of contained in this black box, and we don't necessarily know why or how it's working. Now, because of those two problems, how time-consuming it is and the fact that we don't know what's going on, if there is a different algorithm that can be used to solve a problem, it is probably best to use it. But like I said, neural networks can be tasked to do a bunch of different things. So we can use it for image classification. And again, a bunch of the generative AI that we see in things like ChatGPT, those are all neural networks as well. So neural networks are incredibly powerful. Now remember, neural networks are constructed using individual parts called perceptrons, which are supposed to be analogous to the neurons in animal brains. And the perceptron takes in multiple inputs, each of which get weighted. It finds the linear combination or the sum of each of its inputs multiplied by its weights. We add a specific bias for that perceptron, and then we input everything into an activation function for that specific perceptron. So remember, if I have it set up like this, my perceptron here, my output here is the orange. I'm inputting just 2, so this is about as simple of a model as we can possibly begin with. Each of those inputs have a certain value, again given by A. And I want to know how much weight should each of those carry. Well, those weights are going to be the parameters that I tune, or I'm sorry, the parameters that I train when I actually go ahead and try to create my model. And so we take each of those values, we multiply it by the weights, add them together. We add that bias B, and then we have to plug it into our activation function to find that final value. Now, depending on the purpose of our neural network, there are different activation functions that we can use. If I want each perceptron to be a probability between 0 and 1, we use the sigmoid to kind of squish it between 0 and 1. If I just want every negative value to be 0 to basically turn off that neuron or that perceptron, we can use the ReLU or the rectified linear unit. Or if I literally just want on and off, if I want a 1 or a 0 and I want every perceptron to be either just on or off, 1 or 0, we can use the step or the Heaviside function. And there are many other choices for activation as well, but these are probably the most popular. Now, what neural networks do is they link together hundreds or sometimes thousands of those individual perceptrons into the layer. And then multiple layers will make up our neural network, where every value from every perceptron in one layer will feed forward into the perceptrons in the next layer, but with a new set of weights. So every single time we do that, there is a new weight, and for every single perceptron, there's also a new bias that goes along with that, which means there's an enormous amount of parameters that we need to determine when we train our neural networks. Our final output, though, is typically just going to be a one-dimensional vector of probabilities, which all correspond to particular classes or categories that we think that our input should be classified into. Or in the case of generative AI like ChatGPT, what should be the next word that comes at the next part of our sentence. Okay, so we talked about text, images. What about other types of classification? Well, now we have a bunch of other machine learning algorithms that work well here as well, like the KNN, SVM, and trees. So let's talk about those. So the K-nearest neighbor algorithm Now again, we start with our data that's already been grouped according to the target. And then what we do is when we get new data, to classify this new data point, the algorithm will look at the k nearest data points closest to this new data point. So for example, if I choose k equals 3, because I don't know whether this new data point should be part of the green or maybe the red, because, well, we probably know it's not blue. If I look at the 3 nearest neighbors, well, there's 2 green and 1 red, so I'm going to classify this new point as green because it has more green neighbors instead of classifying it as red. Now, the k nearest neighbor algorithm is so quick and it is so simple, and the only parameters we have to tune are really going to be the value of k, how many neighbors we're going to use, and then our distance metric as well. Now again, typically we think of distance in terms of like Euclidean distance, but remember, there's lots of other distance metrics we can use as well, and sometimes choosing a different one can actually get us better results. But what's nice is that, again, the KNN is so fast, it is so easy that performing cross-validation for multiple values of k is also incredibly quick and easy, and so we can usually tune these very, very effectively. And because it's so effective, so cheap, and so simple, k nearest neighbor is commonly used for a lot of recommendation engines, like the ones that Amazon uses to recommend products, or Netflix and Spotify use to recommend songs or movies or shows for you to watch next. The other type of classification model that we can use are called support vector machines, or the SVMs. And these are classification algorithms that are going to find the optimal boundary between classes. So what we do is, again, once we have our data that is grouped, we find the data points that are closest to what those boundaries would be. Those become called our support vectors. And what we do is we try to create the maximum distance between the support vectors, right? We want to maximize the margin between the classes. That gives us our optimal hyperplane, which divides our data. And then once we have that boundary, our new data points will simply be classified on which side of that optimal hyperplane that our data falls in. Now, support vector machines are actually incredibly powerful. They are incredibly useful, especially when we combine them with other tricks like the kernel trick. So when we look at this picture, like, oh, okay, well, here's this line that divides these two data sets that are clearly separated by a line. The kernel trick adds an extra dimension to our data, so even if our separation isn't a line, the kernel trick is going to add an extra dimension so that I can separate my data now with a plane instead, or a hyperplane, or a plane in as many dimensions as we need for our data. And it's, again, incredibly powerful and incredibly useful for doing classification problems. This means that SVMs can also be used in regression models. They can be used for natural language processing. And there was a time when we thought that support vector machines were going to be the future of machine learning and the future of AI, but it definitely seems like neural networks have outpaced them as well. But again, what's nice, support vector machines are quicker and easier than neural networks to train. And we can typically, again, visualize and see exactly why it's making the decisions it's going to make. So SVMs really do have an important part to play in creating machine learning models. Lastly, we also have our decision trees. These are really, really useful for determining exactly which features are important when predicting typically a binomial target. Decision trees easily use categorical features and numerical features. So again, I can use quantitative or qualitative variables to make my predictions. And remember, it starts with all of our data. And what happens is we're going to ask binary questions, and we're trying to split the data into separate groups, hopefully based upon the target. So we'll make decision 1. That splits our data into 2 groups. Hopefully those groups have more of the target in one and less of the target in the other, because we've made that one decision and we can see clearly what the decision is. And then our leaf nodes can then turn into decision nodes again, and I can make decision 2 and split my data again. And the goal is that hopefully by the end, each of our leaf nodes only really has one type of the target, or mostly is only one type of the target. And what makes this really, really, really useful is that they're also very easy to read, because we know exactly what the decision is being made at each one of the decision nodes. We will see exactly how much of the data, what proportion of the total data is in each group, and we can see what is the proportion of the target variable in each group. And so, again, Decision trees are very useful because they are very, very easy to understand. But even though they're easy to understand and they show us exactly how the decisions are being made and are very helpful in determining important features, they're also very prone to overfitting our data, or they have very high variance, meaning they confuse the noise for the signal and they make future predictions inaccurate. And again, it's very important to then test later on with our testing data, is my decision tree actually working appropriately? To get around this, the random forest models are really, really useful. These are, again, ensemble models. And what random forests do is they take advantage of how simple it is to make decision trees and how easy and quick it is. So they will make many, many trees and then compare the outcomes of those trees to figure out the best way to do the problem. And again, it also lets us kind of expand what we're doing, and there's different ways to set up the random forest models to see what is actually going to be our best choice for what we're trying to predict. We can also use decision trees to predict values. These are typically regression trees. But again, like I've mentioned with a lot of these things, if we know how they work, we can know how to work with them and hopefully use them for whichever task it is we have, whatever task it is we're trying to solve. Let's put it all together now. First question, do I know my target variable? Yes or no? The answer is no. We're using a clustering model, and that typically means k-means. If I do know my target variable, then I need to ask another question, what am I trying to predict? If it is a value, then I want to create a regression model. If I'm trying to predict a category, then I'm using classification, but what am I trying to classify? Is it text, images, or other? If it's text, the best one is probably naive Bayes. If it's an image, really the only way we can go about this is with a neural network. And again, we can combine a simple neural network with a convolutional neural network with a recurrent neural network, depending upon the type of problem we're trying to solve. And if it's just another type of classification, well, maybe k-nearest neighbor works, or maybe a support vector machine, or maybe one of our trees type of model. All right. So there is one part we have left out from the sklearn cheat sheet. That is this part on dimensional reduction. So again, I kind of think of that more as almost the data cleaning aspect. When we do our PCA or principal component analysis, a lot of times we can eliminate variables that aren't going to help with prediction. And again, I think that more is almost cleaning the data or trying to find the structure kind of along with clustering where let's say, I don't know, let's say all my data is observations of circles. And so we have radiuses and diameters. Well, the radius is twice the diameter, so that variable is actually telling me the same information, so we can get rid of one of those. That's kind of that dimensionality reduction, very simple. But again, my main question was, how do I determine which machine learning algorithm I want to use? And so, can we answer that question? Can you now fill in this decision tree on your own about which model would be the best one to choose? All right. Well, I hope this was informative. I hope this was interesting. And as always, please, please take care of yourselves.